So welcome everyone. Today's webinar is meeting people where they are, co-producing research with communities. We're focusing on what really a good experience when working with universities as a co-researcher looks and feels like in practice. So just to give you an overview of what we'll be going through today, there's obviously a lot of language that sits in the kind of co-production participatory research space. So we'll introduce some of the kind of key terms that we worked with everyone in the January workshop and that are core to kind of what we'll be discussing today. I'll then hand over to Bryony, who's going to give an overview of the wider co-production features inquiry that this webinar and our January workshop were a part of. And then I'll go into the findings that came through the community research workshop that we held in January, and it's lovely to see people who joined that workshop on today's call. And we'll also be having the involvement of Hannah Walton, who was one of the workshop participants, to share her views as part of that on kind of hopes for the future. We'll also, and calls for action for universities. We'll also be going through work that Bryony has done, mapping existing and emerging initiatives to those hopes for the future. So hopefully that's a useful way for people to find out more about what's going on and what's available currently. And then we'll be opening a discussion to understand a bit more about your own experiences and anything we might have missed, both from our January workshop and how we've summarised those perspectives. We'll be closing the webinar with some next steps from the co-production futures inquiry, and it's just great to see so many people today. This is an area of work that Bryony and I are particularly passionate about, so it's lovely to be joined by similar passionate people. So kind of starting with, I suppose, a kind of looking at the language and making sure that that is as inclusive as possible. So a number of key terms that we'll be kind of going through today are participatory and co-produced research. So this is research that is led by people with lived experience or working with people with lived experience to ensure that communities are inclusively involved in work that really matters to them, and how you do this in a ethical and meaningful practice way. We also use the terms community and peer researchers. So these are ways that different people might also describe themselves, people from communities who have developed research skills and brought also their lived experience expertise into those research projects. We're having a very strong focus in this discussion on what values really mean in practice. So values are things that really kind of connect and drive and hold our work together in that inclusive and mutually beneficial space. We are looking particularly today at kind of what people shared in January about their felt experiences of research partnerships with universities. So this is about how actually going through that research journey with an academic partner really affected them at different points, and what the different actions were that led to that felt experience. We'll also be reflecting on the fact that we had both community organisations and community partners involved in that workshop. So we've got different perspectives, people who were actively delivering the research as a community or peer researchers, or community organisations who partnered with a university on the research. We are going to go through what we did in the January workshop in terms of a journey mapping exercise. So this was not just looking at what research meant at one point to people and how they experienced it, but really that's that whole journey from building relationships through the research delivery into analysis and into those kind of next steps, and also how people felt about the kind of ending of work as well. Finally, finally for our terms, but where we'll start, we also used in the workshop wake-up questions. So we're very aware that people have busy lives, and starting to talk with a group of new people about felt experiences is quite a step when you may have been coming from other things. So we used a wake-up question exercise in our January workshop to really build that sense of trust and relationship, and also to give an opportunity for people to get to know each other quickly and confidently. So just moving us on. I'll hand over to Bryony now, who will give a bit of background to the co-production futures inquiry.
Wonderful, thanks Al. Hi everyone, it's lovely to see so many of you here. I'm Bryony, I'm a postdoctoral researcher on the Co-Pro Futures Inquiry, which the workshop we'll be talking about today forms a part of. So I just wanted to give you a very brief background about the wider Co-Pro Futures Inquiry in case you aren't already familiar with it. So it was set up in September 2024, and the aim of the inquiry is to identify and propose practical measures to address the barriers to doing participatory and co-produced research within UK universities. And it's co-led by Professors Beth Perry, Catherine Durose and Liz Richardson at the universities of Sheffield, Manchester and Liverpool. And this inquiry came out of this recognition that funders and policymakers are increasingly asking for research to be co-produced with the people and communities that it directly affects. But at the same time, the university systems and processes aren't necessarily set up to support that kind of work. And oftentimes it's quite difficult to do participatory and co-produced research, particularly for community partners, and it can kind of limit their meaningful involvement across the whole research process. So since 2024, we've been bringing together collective intelligence from anybody involved in co-producing research with universities to understand and demonstrate the size and scale of the problem, so what the barriers are, as well as what's already working well and how things can be improved. So far this has involved workshops. We've done a national call for evidence and ideas, which I'll explain in a minute. We're doing a landscape review at the moment, and also input from members of the inquiry. So we have 3 groups here which are supporting the inquiry alongside the co-leads. And that's our community reference group, which is made up of individuals with expertise in co-producing research with universities. An inquiry panel, which is comprised of key stakeholders, including funders, research users, policy partners and infrastructure organisations. And then we also have a funders group, which is made up of key colleagues across the 3 institutions that we come from, and they work in kind of research and development roles in our institutions. So we've been seeking all of their input throughout the process of the inquiry. And then in terms of what we've found so far, and kind of how the workshop we'll be talking about today fits into that. Last year, we held our national call for evidence and ideas, as I mentioned. So we invited anybody involved in co-producing research to outline the barriers to doing this work and any solutions that are being tried and tested. So we received about 240 pieces of evidence to this from funders, academics, university staff, charities, and a select number of community-based organisations. And some of the issues raised, which probably won't be a massive surprise to many of you here, included how difficult it can be to pay co-researchers or community partners for their contribution and their time, particularly because of inflexible university systems. We also heard about a lack of awareness around tax implications and how payments for research involvement can negatively affect people who are in receipt of benefits. Other barriers related to things like contracts and intellectual property. So contracts and consent forms are often inaccessible, and oftentimes the default is that the university owns the data, even when a project is co-produced. We also heard that ethics approval processes can be particularly challenging and time-consuming. And these systems often don't recognise community researchers as researchers. Instead, they're classed as participants, which makes approval processes either impossible or very time-consuming. And then, of course, we have the constraints of short or linear funding timelines and the prioritisation of more traditional research outputs as opposed to the kind of impacts and outputs of co-produced and participatory work. So that's just a whistle-stop tour of the evidence, but you can read more about this in our report, which I've linked to here, and we'll obviously share this around afterwards as well. But while a lot of this evidence gave us a good understanding of the issues from the university or institutional perspective, it didn't really capture the perspective of community researchers who have experience conducting research with universities. So that leads me nicely on to today's workshop. So as Al will explain in more detail, we conducted a workshop with community researchers to directly understand what are their experiences working with universities. So both things that have worked well and things that could be improved. And we essentially asked them, what does a good experience of working with the university as a community researcher look and feel like in practice? So the reflections from this workshop, which we'll share with you now, are directly informing the Co-Pro Futures Inquiry's sector-wide recommendations, so that we can help to create conditions that are more ethical, more efficient, and more impactful for everyone involved in co-produced research and participatory research. So we're currently in the middle of deliberating with our inquiry panel about how practical change can happen, and these findings are directly feeding into that. So I'll now hand back over to Al, who's going to talk through how we conducted the workshops and what we found.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bryony. I suppose starting with the purpose of the workshop, as Bryony mentioned, it was really both to understand in practical terms what a good experience looked like. So what were people aware of, what was visible to them, but really importantly, how did it make them feel? And so this is all feeding towards the inquiry's overarching theory of change, and feeding in each panel deliberation to inform that kind of whole view, rather than having a view from academia and inside universities and a view from outside universities, from communities. So it was very important for us when we designed the workshop to create a safe and supportive space for community researchers and organisations to feel they could openly share experiences, and that it generated reciprocal value and benefit for everyone who was involved, that they felt it was something where not only they were heard, but actually that they were informing change. It was about valuing people's lived and learnt experience and the importance of intersectional identities, and therefore avoiding it being an extractive process that could take away information from those experiences rather than actually move towards action. We wanted to identify what was valued and what needed greater support, and therefore also what we could do in terms of finding out where those other initiatives were and sharing that information more widely. And it was really important about learning with and from community researchers about what people had felt worked in practice, and how best to advocate for how structural and systemic barriers might be overcome. So over the autumn in 2025, we put out a call of people to express interest in being part of the workshop. And we had a great response with 80 people submitting expressions of interest. We were able to accommodate 15 people in the workshop, and on the day, 14 people took part. And it was really important that we were also valuing their contribution, and therefore we looked very carefully at how we could ensure that their time was valued, and the voucher schemes that were provided as a result. The people who joined us had a huge range of experiences in being part of co-produced research, but what was really important was that they had that direct experience of working with a UK university in different geographic contexts. Our workshop included the perspectives of 5 paid community researchers, 5 volunteer community researchers, and 4 representatives from community-based organisations who had developed that research partnership with universities. It was held online over the course of a morning, and it involved a series of different types of group discussion and journey mapping, where we captured what came out on a Miro board. So just to walk through kind of what that research covered, we started with that very kind of close and personal experience. So we asked the question, what feeling or emotion describes people's experiences of community research projects, and why had it made them feel this way? We then went into that kind of practical view of kind of looking at community research journeys at different stages, and what had happened at each stage to make people feel valued, or to actually hinder that sense of reciprocity and mutual benefit. We then came back together and looked at what universities should prioritise to improve the experiences of community researchers and community organisations, and what would be the most effective changes that could be made. So looking at that kind of first point around what feeling or emotion describes your experience of community research projects and why it made people feel this way, these were the core themes that came out. So there was a really first kind of positive wave of emotion, that it felt empowering, that people felt legitimised. It gave an opportunity to have agency and ownership over what they'd contributed and done. That working in partnership with a university meant that people felt their voices and opinions could be amplified, and therefore they had more opportunity and a direct contribution to change. Also, by taking on this role with other people within their community, they were able to work in partnership with people who were seldom heard. And people did believe that it was an impactful approach. So it was focusing on the importance of lived experience as a way in which we can actually change systems. And when done right, they felt it was impactful in being able to see change happening. We were really struck by how energized people were when they were talking about their felt experiences, but also there was a point where people also voiced a feeling of cautiousness that came in, and we'll talk about that in terms of the increased cautiousness as the research journey went on. So there was almost a flood of energy and emotion at the beginning that was incredibly positive, but then the realization of that in practice, where sometimes momentum was lost, power imbalances were not addressed, the importance of addressing language barriers wasn't prioritized, and the realities of short-term funding meant that that kind of positive energy seemed to dissipate. I'll just move to the next slide. Overarchingly, culture and relationships were the things that people felt were most important and valued. So if people, at that point about being initially empowered by people's experience working with universities, and their voices being able to be amplified and legitimized with the university's resources behind them, that led to that very positive potential about the impact that they could have for their own community and with policymakers. But digging into this point around cautiousness, and the feeling that actually as you went into the process, it didn't quite live up to expectation. And at some points, people felt rushed, for example, particularly during analysis stages or write-up. And there was a loss of momentum and commitment when it came through to dissemination. Apologies, Peter, if you could just pop any thoughts or reflections in the chat, because we'll just not be able to answer everyone's questions live, if that's okay. So there was a feeling that research partnerships seemed to drop off in their commitments at the analysis or dissemination stage, which meant that the emotional impact was that some community partners felt let down or disappointed. Other issues that arose was the lack of addressing a focus on accessibility, language or cultural needs, and power imbalances. Overall, community researchers called for greater commitment to focusing on sustaining relationships. So moving into kind of what we looked at then more practically, we broke down the whole research journey into kind of these 8 stages. Apologies, this is incredibly small, but we wanted to just show you the Miro board that we used within the workshop. And so these 8 stages, what you can start to see is that there's a real kind of energy and clustering of positive experiences that happens towards the beginning of the journey that sometimes drop off as we move through. People who joined the workshop then were asked to reflect on the kind of actions that had led to what they felt as emotional experiences, and kind of how barriers and enablers were visible to them to move through this process together. We also then looked at the hopes for a kind of shift and a change from things that they might have experienced previously. So in terms of the barriers that came across in the research journey, I've mentioned in passing that accessibility was a really important aspect for many people. So when involving people, people didn't always feel that their needs around language had been identified and responded to. There was a focus on falling back into jargon and technical speak. And accessibility was also not just about materials or language that was used, but also the spaces that were involved. And so a lot of interview spaces where people were expected to travel and come within universities rather than people going to where people were. Project activities seemed to centre on when researchers were more available, rather than thinking about community researchers' priorities and involvement outside of that. And so people commented that some of the university-based activities, the rooms, the kind of getting into buildings, made it feel kind of that this wasn't an accessible approach to them. Payments, which Bryony has related to in the wider CoPro inquiry findings, came up as a barrier in terms of there was a delay in how payments actually could be paid out to people, and that they weren't really thought about before the project started in the level of detail. So if people also undertook training and they'd obviously given hours to that, payments were not easily and readily available. There was also a convoluted payments process where people weren't able to access payment through cash. And so that limited opportunities for certain people. It felt like there was a difficult backwards and forwards to move things forward, and people had to wait a long time to actually have some of these issues resolved, which obviously had an impact on trust. In terms of ethics, again, that process that was held within the university kind of moved that kind of sharing of ownership and power away. So there was a lot of backwards and forwards to then get into the actual research delivery. And the ethics process generally was not user-friendly. There was also a lot of unrecognised and unpaid labour during the data collection stage. So additional things that researchers within universities didn't necessarily recognise, but that community or peer researchers knew were critical so that they could actually involve people who had lived experience. But that time and that expertise was not necessarily recognised or credited. Time and funding was a barrier kind of across the whole process, but had concentrated points. So when people reached the point of analysis and write-up, both there was limited time to involve people in an inclusive way from communities within this, and there was less training than the research training about research methods in the field. So less people actually were involved in this stage more generally. And overall, there was a reflection that it felt like at this point, there was a rushing. The project was short term, and then suddenly this concentration meant that the critical stage of bringing together those learnings felt to move away from an inclusive participatory approach. We also felt that people actually felt that this stage was extractive. So where there had been a building of expectations to be able to demonstrate skills in writing, to co-produce outputs, to co-write together, some people actually didn't get to write a report. That was done within the university by the academic researchers. And at this point, someone shared that I felt like we were guinea pigs in a tick-boxing exercise. They had been the people who had gone out and worked with others in their community, but then that ownership removed away from them when they had been able to secure and deliver the interviews or workshops or focus groups. But it is not all bad news. There were a number of key enablers that people in the workshop identified that really improved the felt experiences across the community research journey. Focusing on transparency was critical. So being realistic and clear about the long-term impact, speaking in a clear language from the outset, embedding a commitment to ongoing reflection together, and understanding at the beginning why this research would be important to everyone involved, to break down the power imbalances and barriers. So it felt like the focus on shared value was there from the beginning. Navigating, negotiating, and brokering were kind of words that people used to describe when academic researchers played an incredibly helpful role in making the partnerships work within the systems of universities. So having someone, a point of contact on the university side, that someone who was committed to helping navigate the complex and obviously sometimes hidden systems around university payments, for example. And also people who checked in after interviews. So that ongoing focus on everyone's well-being, so that actually it was understood you're not carrying the burden on your own interviews that might have been challenging or didn't go as expected. There was someone who was there as a responsive team member afterwards. Actually really believing in what it meant to have an equitable partnership. So this was a lovely way that people described where they had a learning researcher rather than a lecturing researcher, someone who was going on that journey with them. Being listened to and kept updated was really critical, and that commitment to that shared ownership. So always being involved in the kind of joint presentation of work together with universities. Another key theme that came out as an enabler was where partnerships had focused on training and capacity building, and that this was acknowledged as both valuable to individual community members, but to the project as a whole and the outcomes of the work together. So the fact that actually that investment in training was acknowledged, and therefore actually when people went out as a community researcher or peer researcher, it gave them increased confidence in meeting members of the community and having a role where they wouldn't normally be in contact with those people, but actually feeling empowered about what that role now meant and how they could feel supported within it. It was also about helping support and navigate the ethical decisions together. Through the training, actually being able to look at things and move beyond just the outline proposal into the real and lived experience of the research. Another enabler that came out was around legitimacy and impact. So that actually people had many examples where by working with universities, it meant that their own views and work with the community were more respected and there was a wider community view accessible. The focus on workshops that showcased the outputs and all of their works, and again, making that visibility in as many spaces as possible. So I'll now hand over to Bryony and Hannah to focus on the hopes.
Wonderful, thanks, Al. So yes, after we discuss the enablers and the barriers, we asked people what they would like universities to prioritise in order to improve the experiences of community researchers and what needs to change. So I'll just summarise some of the hopes that people mentioned, and then I'll hand over to Hannah, who will kind of share some reflections from her own experiences. So these hopes spoke to both the types of broader cultural change needed within universities in terms of how they prioritise and value participatory research, as well as the more kind of practical day-to-day experience of how partnerships are delivered and felt on the ground. So overall, people highlighted the need for the university to take a more sustainable and streamlined approach to community partnerships. So this was in response to the way that participatory projects are often brought to a halt due to a lack of funding or shifting institutional priorities. And this quote from one person sums up this feeling when they said, "What happens to us when the project ends?" So this kind of speaks to the need for universities to understand that participatory research relationships aren't contained within specific funded research projects, but they're ongoing relationships. And then related to this, people's hopes were for universities to become more embedded in communities as a kind of long-term engagement, and therefore be responsive to community priorities, as opposed to academics coming in and out with particular research agendas or research questions already in mind. And then when I get on to talking about the emerging initiatives in a moment, we'll see how things like research hubs can be really useful in this regard, which act as a bridge between the university and the community. And then agency and impact, people discussed that improvements were needed in terms of how universities value participatory research. So not only viewing lived experience as expertise, but also ensuring that research leads to tangible benefits for communities. And this also involves recognizing that these benefits as impact in academic research. So the skills that co-researchers have acquired by engaging in the research and the localized benefits to individual community members as impact. And then turning to the kind of day-to-day experience of the partnerships, people identified 2 areas for improvement. The first relates to some concrete institutional changes to processes that would improve community researchers' experiences. And the second relates to the values and support that academics bring to the partnership. And as we'll see, there are things here that could be really improved if universities were to provide more support and invest in and upskill individual academics to be able to better support community researchers. Because as I think someone mentioned in the chat just now, that academics are really stretched, and this is kind of why the participation kind of drops off towards the end of these projects, amongst a whole host of other reasons. So as we've mentioned, improvements to payment processes, in particular, people mentioned setting up payments earlier, having a central funding pot that could be easily accessed as a way to kind of streamline the process and minimize delays, as well as providing wider voucher options or wider payment options in general, depending on how people want to get paid, because it's very context specific. Having more time for data collection and training, as we've heard. People also wanted to see training and formal qualifications offered to co-researchers as a default from the university, which would allow them to demonstrate the skills they've acquired through their contribution. Universities are arguably well placed to offer this more widely, particularly with the current resources that they have. And when we look at the emerging initiatives, there are some promising examples of this already. And then linked to this, people emphasize that partnerships should be mutually beneficial. So, alongside formal training, this means providing community partners with access to networks, fair incentives, and producing findings in formats that can actually be used by them and distributed by them in a meaningful way. And then in terms of the kind of wider values and felt experience of the research project itself, people highlighted 4 kind of key things. So transparency, accessibility, support, and respect. So people wanted researchers to be upfront about the project's aims, timelines, and expectations, and crucially, its limitations. So, being open about the impact of funding constraints, being open about any anticipated delays with payments. People were very understanding about the fact that university processes are difficult, and they didn't necessarily blame individual researchers. The important thing for them was communication and transparency about this from the beginning. And then on accessibility, people wanted to see university partners using community-based venues for meetings and project activities, and offering flexible meeting times around people's needs and their commitments. So as one person put it, it's about meeting people where they are. And then emotional and well-being support was also mentioned. So kind of providing this support throughout the project, not just in conducting the research and undertaking the methods, but in how community researchers are feeling as they do it and the impacts that this research might have on them, particularly when the topic is sensitive. And linked to this, people raised the need for better availability of academics throughout the project to be able to offer this support. So, there are many university community partnerships that are approached in this way, but a lot of the time it relies on pockets of good practice or a disproportionate amount of relational or administrative labor from everyone involved in the project. who are kind of doing this despite, not because of, the current system, as we've kind of put it in the inquiry. So a kind of key takeaway here for us is that universities have this responsibility to actively support academic staff and community partners to be able to do this, and to embed this culturally, so that, you know, equitable, respectful partnerships are seen as the default, not something that depends on, you know, individual academics or individual projects. So that means investing in training and resources, improving institutional processes, and shifting how this kind of community research is valued institutionally. So that was kind of a whistle-stop tour of the hopes there. But now I'd just like to hand over to Hannah Walton, who's participated in our workshop in January. And she's just going to kind of flesh out some of these and share her experiences as a kind of social researcher who has worked on kind of as a youth rights practitioner and a lived experience community researcher alongside universities. So Hannah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Bryony. Yeah, I'm not going to be talking for too long because the rest of the workshop is fantastic and you don't need to hear me talk too long. But so I obviously took part in the as a community research contributor in the Pro Futures Inquiry in January, which feels like a lifetime ago, but also this year's gone really quick. So my work essentially sits at sort of the intersection of communities and institutions. So I particularly look at how power, opportunity, knowledge shapes young people's lives through systems like education. So a big part of my work involves working alongside communities and with universities to support a more meaningful co-production, particularly with those who are often left out of conversations. Alongside that work, I also am studying a PhD in education and social justice, so that kind of ties it all together quite nicely. My work comes from a lived experience background, so this sort of the co-pro future inquiry is very aligned with how I see co-production with universities. So I didn't have a traditional pathway going into higher education. I left school early, got 4 GCSEs, didn't do any A-levels, went straight into a master's degree through volunteering community work. Since then, I've studied and worked with multiple universities, which has given me a very strong insight into how different universities and institutions operate. It's kind of, it almost feels like I'm infiltrating as someone from a low income working class background. It feels like I shouldn't be there. And so when those processes really work, it shows. So not just in terms of access, but also how they understand and apply co-production within research and across the wider community, university community as well. I've also worked alongside organisations across the UK and across different sectors. So a lot of I feel like co-production needs to be interdisciplinary. It has to go across sectors. We have to communicate. We have to take what one sector is doing and apply it to other sectors and work across that. You can't just say, okay, this is what they're doing there and leave it at that and pretend it's not. If it's working, it's working. So when you're developing ways of thinking and problem solving and it's working and it's recognized through universities, it's incredibly valuable. What reflected for me in the workshop is that the sense of co-production, as has been mentioned, happens despite systems and not because of them. There's this missing middle between ambition to do participatory work and the reality of how universities are structured, whether that's funding, ethics, or institutional processes. And I think that it really sits within the close shift from knowledge transfer to knowledge exchange. Because for a lot of people with lived experience like myself, it's not just about contributing to the research, it's about being recognised as someone who holds that knowledge, the insight, the experience in their own right. There are people who have lived experience that you just wouldn't be able to get that insight if you hadn't spoken to them. There's just no way of doing it. You have to speak to the communities. And from my experience of being both inside and outside of these systems and working directly with student unions and universities, I've seen how the design of those systems can either open doors or close them. Things like flexibility, accessibility, how people are engaging really matters. For me, an accessibility adjustment that works really well for myself personally is being able to work on a hybrid model or a remote model, and that just works really well. I'm able to participate in my best capacity for that. I know for people with other disabilities that also see that as a really strong way of participating. It just removes the barriers of finances and also health and everything else. So it really is important to make sure the accessibility is there. And I think the graphic in the report really captures this well, that it can be really powerful and impactful. But it's also a bit complex and messy sometimes. And I've seen both sides of those. So when it's done really well, particularly in higher education, it can be really transformative. It can really do some incredible work. And it doesn't just improve the research, it changes who feels able to be part of that research. And it builds the confidence and creates a sense of belonging that people are then able to express those experiences and contribute to something wider than themselves. So for me, the impact about getting this right is huge. It's not just about getting better research, it's about shifting who research is for and who gets to shape it. And then over time, we move towards universities that don't just engage with communities, but are genuinely shaped by those communities, and the knowledge and experience that brings. So yeah, I'm going to hand back to Bryony, but thank you for listening to my experience.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I think you summed that up perfectly. It was really powerfully put. And that does bring us nicely on to some of the existing and emerging initiatives that are working towards improving some of these issues that we've discussed. So we just wanted to touch on a few key ones here today that directly speak to the themes that came up in the workshop. I don't have time to go through each of these in depth, but they're linked to in the slides, which we will share with you afterwards. And, as I said, this is by no means an exhaustive list. There's more of these outlined in our call for evidence report, which was linked to at the beginning. And we're also in the middle of conducting a landscape review within the inquiry. And this is mapping the full range of initiatives it's hoping to map the full range of initiatives and networks working to shift the conditions for participatory and co-produced research. So once that's done, we will also be able to share that with everybody. But what we've kind of noticed in the inquiry, as I mentioned, is that improvements are happening at localized levels. There are glimmers of hope like these ones outlined here, but the challenge is how to coordinate this action beyond individuals, beyond institutions. And this is currently what we're grappling with now. So in terms of kind of equitable and respectful partnerships, there are some examples of charters and agreements which set out shared principles and commitments for more equitable university community partnerships. So, for example, we have the Greater Manchester Respectful Research Charter. This outlines a set of principles for fair, respectful and sustainable partnerships, which community-based organisations can take into their collaborations with universities, and which universities can also hopefully adopt and embed themselves as common practice. There's also the wider civic university agreements, which are formal place-based commitments which set out how universities will use their resources to improve their local area. And then the Civic University Network and the National Civic Impact Accelerator have done amazing work building on this by connecting universities across the UK who are committed to deepening their local impact. And they've been supported to kind of deliver and demonstrate this impact in practice. There are also examples of instances where universities are providing online courses and training, which can work to embed this culture of equitable, respectful, inclusive research. So this one at the Open University aims to do this by sharing best practice examples as part of their equitable research online training. And, universities are well placed to offer this kind of across the board. So these are models that we could see rolled out elsewhere. We're also seeing more embedded models like participatory research hubs, which are embedded within the community and act as a bridge between the university and the community. So, for example, they could match universities up with organizations and community groups who want to do research together and identify priority areas that are meaningful to the community. So this bridging role can help to avoid that issue of academics coming in and out of communities and create a more sustainable, embedded, ongoing, and streamlined approach to community research. So the Centre for Justice and Community Action at Durham University kind of tried to do some of these things, and there's other examples as well across the UK. And then training and qualifications, which was a massive part of the workshop, as you've heard. There are a handful of examples of formal qualifications and ways that co-researchers can recognise the skills that they obtain through their contribution. So there's the Citizen Science Certificate from UCL. There's also things like the Fulfilling Lives peer researcher trainings and community research training offered by the Institute for Social Justice. The Young Foundation did also used to have a level 2 award in peer research, but this has now been retired. But this kind of shows that, you know, universities are kind of well placed to offer this, and they could step up to provide formal training and qualifications for co-researchers. And then there's also some work ongoing within individual institutions which are aimed at improving processes and structures. So at Manchester, they've been working to improve the payments process for co-researchers, and they've also produced a new set of ethics guidelines on co-production and community engagement. At Sheffield, we're working with our contracts team to try to improve the contracts process for co-produced research, which has involved lengthy discussions around data ownership and intellectual property. And we're also feeding some of that back into our representatives from funders in our inquiry panel. And there are also other examples from other universities like Reading and Hull who have had success in these areas. And then last but not least, there's ongoing work in the funding space. So the British Science Association, for example, are doing some great work around improving funding processes for co-produced research. Their Ideas Fund grants program directly funds community organisations to work in partnership with researchers. They've also developed an impact framework to help them identify and reflect on the kinds of outcomes and impacts that are possible from these partnerships, which go beyond traditional metrics. So that's, you know, an example of a model that could be rolled out more widely. Oh, sorry, we're not ready for that yet. So as I said, there's pockets of really good work happening. The question is now, how do we move from both intention and principles and pilots to more embedded everyday practice within individual institutions? And what we keep coming back to in our discussions in the inquiry is the value of relational infrastructure in building capacity and galvanizing these localized responses. So we've discussed a need for an ongoing space to share and map ongoing practice, to learn collectively, to make the impacts of all of this work more visible. And the inquiry itself is one way in which we're doing this, but we need to think longer term, you know, beyond the inquiry. So with all of that in mind and all those big questions for you to chew on, we now want to hear from you, particularly about your experiences working with universities, anything you think that we may have missed, or any initiatives like the ones here that we should know of. As I said, we're doing a landscape review, so it would be wonderful to hear of any other initiatives. So we're going to be using WooClap to collect your reflections, and I'm hoping that this will work. So you can either scan the QR code that's on the screen now, or you can go to wooclap.com and type in the code at the top of the screen. And yes, we will just wait until most of you have joined, and I'll hand over to Al, who will guide you through the questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bryony. So as Bryony was saying, what's amazing today is that we have a much wider group who are obviously experienced and passionate about this area of work too. And it's really important that what we have learned so far from the workshop and the CoPro Futures Inquiry is part, but definitely not the whole of what people have been experiencing. So we have kind of 4 questions for the last kind of 20 minutes or so, 15, 20 minutes. And WooClap's going to allow us to visualize in real time everyone's responses to those questions. So the first question really reflects on where we started with our community researcher perspectives workshop. And the question is, what are your felt experiences of working with universities, and what might we have missed? So if you're just able to take a couple of minutes to kind of reflect and pop down your ideas, and we'll start to see those kind of coming through on the screen. And I'll pick out some of the things that are therefore kind of people are sharing, but also kind of where we're seeing a lot of agreement about things that felt experiences with universities generate at the moment. Sorry, Peter, if you have questions, are you okay just to pop it in the chat? Great. And as you do that, we can start to see people's responses coming in. Prefer to speak as possible. It may just, Bryony, are we able to do that whilst people's responses are coming in?
I can attempt to unmute. I'm not sure if it will let me though, because we're in the webinar mode.
Yeah, may not be possible with this number of people. But again, if you're not able to pop it in the chat, Peter, or through WooClap, we can also obviously also follow up afterwards. But just as we're looking at that and we're starting to see responses kind of coming in. So words that kind of stand out to me, the idea of it being a bit of a roller coaster is a really powerful way to describe that. We've also got feeling rushed as a volunteer. That translation was a really critical point. There's a dominant focus on community that people have popped down performative, actionable. So there's a real mix, which definitely is what we found also in our January workshop, of where there's potential and really kind of positive things that come through that this as an approach. But the reality of things being, and people have put it here, inflexible, the administration. We've also got, oh, sorry, it's moving all the time, which is amazing. Kind of hacking, and that was something that came through as well. Having people who could broker, negotiate, navigate, and hack systems that could otherwise be challenging or impenetrable. We've got turning oil tankers, which again is a really powerful phrase. Kind of how do you move a whole sector and institution through this work? Feeling small, being seen, the kind of the idea that some of these things are closed down. We've got focus on being together, partnerships, practical. So we're really kind of seeing that again, that mix. And what we're really kind of interested in here is there are obviously things about that kind of overall felt experience, but real kind of focus on things where actually these point to not an entire process working for people within communities and carrying out community research. Issues around power, the heaviness of the work, focus on values and practice coming through now really strongly as well, and kind of what that means, extraction and hierarchical. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and what we'll do is we'll obviously share the slides afterwards so people can see what comes through, but I think this is very much similar in that kind of mix of what could be, but maybe what isn't always realised. Kind of where are the usual suspects? Where are the unusual suspects being missed, and the mining of experiences? So thank you so much. We might move Bryony to the next question, if that's okay. So our next question is from then, I suppose, those kind of research findings that we shared back, both about kind of enablers, barriers, hopes. Was there, which findings most resonated with your own experience? And we'll again just take a couple of moments for people to add their thoughts. So we're moving from the kind of felt experience to the practical experience that people had. So we've got the challenges of payment processes, lack of accessibility and people not meeting people where they are. Yeah, that even community research can feel extractive. Administrative processes. Yes, the need for long-term relationships, and that was something that came through incredibly strongly for us. Concrete next steps, yes, that was always a challenge. So one of the things for people ending one project, what would happen to them, what would happen to what had been built as a team, the feeling that they'd had, where they would want to go next, but those concrete next steps weren't always clear or realised. Systemic issues, delays in payment and not recognising communities' time financially. So yeah, absolutely, all of the additional emotional and administrative labour. The focus on relationship building. Yeah, all of it. It was affirming and a bit scary about how much it overlapped with our institution. The well-meaningness of kind of individual academics, but maybe not being able to realise what that potential is, the general culture of universities, the need for transparency and openness, that was really, really important. People were, as Bryony said, incredibly understanding that things weren't perfect, systems weren't perfect, but when people weren't transparent with them, and that was when the kind of trust broke down. Running out of steam, volunteer burnout. Yeah, absolutely. Great. Lived experience being valued in an equal way as expertise. And what happens, yes, absolutely. This kind of very clear situation that we saw, the kind of drop off as you went through the research journey together, it became more separate, less clear, less co-owned, and the potential not being realised. Yeah, relational practice and the importance of that. I mean, how we make the case, and that's very much what the Co-Pro Future inquiry wants to do, that if you don't start with that relational approach and you don't support the development and of skills for people to take forward a relational approach, much of it falls by the wayside. Lack of alignment in research agendas, absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you. There is so much on here. This is absolutely amazing. A need to upskill academics, and that was something, yeah, absolutely, that came forward. This wasn't just a focus on community researchers or peer researchers building skills and opportunities, but that it actually needs a change on the other side, how researchers develop their kind of professional training and skills, and really kind of prioritising that for early career researchers. Absolutely. The skew towards data collection being common. Yes, that was almost like the point where everyone felt actually very kind of like there was a huge amount happening, but then afterwards that kind of shrinking of opportunity, engagement and partnership. I loved Hannah's framing of this. This changes who research is for, absolutely. Yeah, that's brilliant. And Bryony, I wonder whether, so we have a third question for you. I wonder whether you can move our screen forward. So Bryony obviously shared, following our January workshop, the work that she started to do, mapping that kind of landscape of initiatives out there. But we know that obviously that's just one view that we're kind of been focused on. So if there are other initiatives or best practice that the Co-Pro Futures Inquiry can help share and profile, if you're just able to pop your thoughts or reflections into that, that would be great. So we've got the University of Edinburgh, Ramp of Ethics to support participatory research. Brilliant. work at the University of Birmingham, Research Better Together. That's great. Community Knowledge Matters Network in Scotland, the University's Bath work on relational practice and welfare and well-being. So it's great to have a geographic spread as well. The outwithed.ac.uk websites, that's great. And these are all things that we'll kind of follow up with afterwards. Good practice mentors, free training on co-production for VCSEs. Yes, absolutely. I'm very aware of good practice mentors, and their work is brilliant. So that's a great shout. Yeah, the need to get research funders on board with this, absolutely. And that's where some of the kind of influencing of the panel for co-pro futures and the final outputs are going to be very much focused. The second, community knowledge matters, spaces for people to network and collective reflection is so important, absolutely. Yeah, that feeling that you're not trying to battle systems in isolation. Great. The service user group, patient carer and public involvement group. Yes, absolutely. So we'll look into the NIHR as well. Yeah, there's a huge amount also in different kind of fields that is happening that that actually drawing together. It was one of the things that came out of the original inquiry report, kind of ensuring that it's we're looking at kind of what's happening and what could happen in STEM subjects as well is really, really important. So there's an excellent and co-creative researchers at London College of Fashion. The service user group, yep. Brilliant. English Standards Board. And the University of Reading. Yes, we've just spoken, actually Bryony and I have just spoken to amazing individual from the University of Reading, Sally. So yeah, that's great. Brilliant. And I'm aware, and just as people's responses are coming in, that we also have kind of reflections that will come through in the chat. So Bryony and I will look at those and also follow up with people kind of individually as well. So this is brilliant, because this kind of really builds our understanding of the landscape and where people can go and connect with others doing great work out there. And Bryony, I wonder whether we now move to our final question.
Yeah, sure. We'll move into the Q&A, but that means that this will go. So if anybody has any other initiatives or anything, there's information at the end which we'll share with you about how to get in touch. But it would be wonderful if you didn't get a chance to pop it on here, if you could email us. So I will now move on to the next. Yes.
So thank you. So yeah, I know things have been coming through in the chat, and apologies that we knew this was a webinar where there was going to be a huge amount of kind of interest and amazing experience, and so we were trying to think of ways where we can ensure that as many views as possible are shared. If you have got any other questions, we'll, as Bryony was saying, we'll obviously go through the chat and follow up with people individually. But we've got other questions and reflections coming through. So Bryony, can you tell us a bit more about kind of where this work will be from Co-Pro Futures will be published?
Yes, so we are currently towards the end of developing our website at the moment. So all of our outputs will be hosted on there. We're hoping for that to be up within the next month or so. And we are on the website. There will also be an interactive online archive. So this is a place for us to share all of the evidence that has been submitted to the inquiry, not just the work within this workshop that we've done, but also the 240 plus pieces of evidence that we received. And we're hoping for this to be a kind of living space where people can continue to update best practices, and it can kind of be this, hopefully an online community of practice that we'll create.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Bryony, I just wonder if you can open a couple of these questions just so that I can see. So is there a resource for anyone who wants to become a community researcher to find opportunities near to them, and where do people find these opportunities? So it's a great question. I think it's one of those things that CoPro Futures has been looking at, because there's a lot of kind of information about place-based projects and work kind of that is related to university, but that idea sometimes it is on individual networks and contacts rather than being able to search those opportunities. So Bryony, I don't know whether, I mean, I know that we looked at in that landscape about existing kind of ways to find out and networks that exist. Does it feel like it's more on a university and an individual institution or organization basis at the moment?
Yeah, so this is something that I'm hoping to kind of delve into more, particularly after this workshop. But I've been mapping networks and communities of practice. Lots of them are, I mean, a lot of them that I've found, but I guess it's also in terms of visibility, are from the kind of university space, like participatory research networks. But this is a great question. So if anybody in the call has an answer to this, it'd be wonderful to know, and I can add this into the landscape review. But this is something that I will be looking at. So thank you for raising this question. What else do we have?
Yes, so we've actually, it is a sector. I'm just looking at the question that says it's a sector level issue. Who's listening in UKRI? So we actually have UKRI involvement in the CoPro Futures panel. So that has been trying to ensure that there's an ongoing engagement and feeding back directly with funders. And so that link with UKRI has been a really critical one alongside kind of other funders. I think it's variable, and I think one of the biggest challenges we have is the shifts in political prioritisation at the moment. But we have some really, really good examples like the British Science Association and kind of how they are trying to, and NCCPE, how they're trying to kind of forward a different way that is long term to think about. This is not project focused funding that people are looking for, but just an ongoing commitment and approach.
And our last inquiry panel deliberation kind of centered around the who. So who are the agents for change? Who do we need to make this case to? Who should we speak to? So we kind of all put our heads together to, and some of those people, you know, are in the room and some of them aren't. So we kind of put our heads together to really nail down who we need to make this case to. And you know, there's different cases to be made to different people in different ways. So, yeah.
There's just a really interesting reflection here. We find a tension between influencing the unconverted, traditional and inflexible, and convening and making friends with people already doing the work, and where to put the energy. Yeah, absolutely. I think we would recognise that as well from things that other people have shared with us. And so I think the thing of taking different approaches depending on where people are on that journey kind of readiness, awareness, engagement, and that's something that the CoPro Futures panel has also looked at. We've also got, do you want to read through this one, Bryony?
Yeah, I'm interested to know whether people in your workshop felt able to have space to share their more negative experience with their wider partnerships. I'm also wondering whether evaluative work thinking is not always the best in this space. How are we checking that we are truly accountable to multiple values and needs? Yes, big questions. I think in terms of the first one, it wasn't something that we specifically asked, but it did feel like this was relayed back to kind of academics and project partners. But at the same time, as I said, people recognize that it's not the fault of individual researchers. So it's that kind of tension there where they're aware that these kind of structures and processes aren't fit for purpose, but it's not the individual researchers that community members are that are at the face of the project. That's the issue. But I think, yeah, a lot of the evidence that we got through the call for evidence from academics was reflecting a lot of these issues on behalf of community partners. So I think everybody is aware of the issues, and yeah, it is kind of relayed back to academics.
Well, thank you for these questions and reflections, and we will kind of go through, because I know some of them are actually things that we can also bring back to the panel, because there's a lot in there. Bryony, just where we've got a couple of minutes to go, so just in terms of letting everyone know next steps.
Yes. So yeah, thank you everyone. And as I said, if you have any further questions, we're really keen to kind of collaborate and share and keep this discussion going. So please email us at coprofutures@gmail.com, but you can also join our LinkedIn group, which is linked to here. And this is kind of you can request access to it, and we'll let you all kind of in, and you can kind of talk amongst yourselves and share any resources and, you know, start discussion. So super quickly, just in terms of where we're at in the inquiry and next steps, as I said, we've presented all of the evidence from the inquiry to our panel members. We're currently in our deliberations with them about how to make this case for change in a way that will land with different stakeholders. And the landscape review as well, which is already mentioned. So this will help us to kind of identify where enabling infrastructure already exists, where practice is emerging, and where there are opportunities to potentially build an ongoing community of practice. Obviously, the website as well, which I mentioned, will be live very soon. So we can send that out via our mailing list and our LinkedIn group. And then in September, once our panel deliberations are finished, we'll have a public launch of our final output, which we'll be developing over the next few months, which will kind of set out our call for action and our kind of next recommendations. So yes, please do join our LinkedIn group. If you want to join the mailing list, please email us at that email, and we will send the slides around to you afterwards, which has links to everything that we've talked about today. So yes, thank you everyone for attending and engaging. It's been really lovely to have the interactive elements of the session, and I hope you all found it useful. And thank you very much.
Thank you.